On the Castilian Meseta, between the Carrion and Pisuerga rivers, lie fertile plains and verdant forests. And it's here where we can find one of the most important concentrations of Roman villas in Hispania. Although this territory came under Roman rule in the 1st century BC, it wasn't until the middle of the 2nd century AD that the transformation of the landscape really began. Over 200 years had passed since the Romans subjugated the Cantabrians, more than 6 generations. Who remembers the brutality of the conquest? From the beginning of the 1st century of the Christian era on, these lands were under the jurisdiction of the Conventus of Clunia, and it was to the city of Clunia that people had to go to have legal disputes settled or to seek justice. At the time, most of the Iberian Peninsula was not occupied by troops. Today, we'd say it was demilitarized. The stationing of the 7th Gemena Legion in León was the one exception. Other changes were also occurring at the time. Slaves were being replaced by tenant farmers and paid workers. Tenant farmers were free men to whom large landowners assigned land under an arrangement that came close to granting them a right of possession. Who were these large landowners? They were known as honestiores, men of high rank, nobles and patrons. They owned large estates called latifundia and were able to defend their tenant farmers legally and even with military means, for they sometimes had private armies at their disposal. Their power and prestige was such that many free farmers, known as humiliores, opted to sell or simply give their land to a large landowner. They would then continue to work the land in exchange for protection. They were still slaves in this society, though. Landowners used them for agricultural work on land reserved for their own direct use. Slaves also performed domestic labor. As an incentive for their work, they were sometimes given livestock or some money. This enabled many slaves to gain the status of freed men and women whose condition was closer to that of free people. The origin of these large properties was often unclear. The honestiores themselves didn't always want to know about the roots of their lineage. Here they remained, far from the decision-making centers of the empire. Faced with the major upheavals of the late 3rd and 4th century, many honestiores and wealthy aristocrats preferred to stay in their protected estates, where they were safe from the fighting and far from Rome's tax collectors and its enemies, the rampant bands of deserters, runaway slaves, and groups of barbarians who dared to roam the lands of imperial Rome. For all these reasons, in the 4th century, the number of villas grew. Owners made major renovations to existing buildings, and many new villas were built. These large mansions were major agricultural centers and produced almost everything people needed to live. The key was to control all production processes, from agricultural operations to industrial activity. What we now know as La Olmeda was one of these country estates. It had existed since the 1st century, but in the middle of the 4th century AD, it was completely remodeled to create an impressive palatial villa. During the second half of the 4th century, the powerful men who lived here enjoyed great prosperity and may have had small armed groups on hand to protect their interests. Nevertheless, the first signs of political and military instability may have been evident as early as the 3rd century. We don't know to what extent the presence of the first armies of barbarian invaders affected the villa, but it's clear that it wasn't destroyed. The villa continued to receive exotic products from Africa, though when the mosaics deteriorated, they were no longer repaired. In any case, from the middle of the 5th century to the first years of the 6th century, it became increasingly clear that the culture that had created these stately villas was doomed to vanish. As a result of violence and insecurity caused by the landless peasants and excluded groups that Roman society had produced. The villa slowly fell into ruin, a casualty of its abandonment and the cumulative ravages of time. The roofs fell in. Metal elements were torn off, others were reused. Erosion and weeds gradually wore down and entombed the structure. And many centuries passed. So many that the existence of the villa was forgotten. Farmers even ended up cultivating the land that lay over its buried walls and mosaic floors. That was until 1968, when Javier Cortés, the owner of the land, discovered the remains of the villa. In 1980, after several years of excavations, he ceded the site to the Palencia Provincial Council, and in 1984, it was open to the public. Today, La Olmeda is an essential part of our historical heritage. The Palencia Provincial Council has built a modern building to conserve the site and allow visitors to see it.